Welcome to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series, a digital program bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Bob Silverman, the Chief Business Officer at Rejuveron. All right, we have got 9:01. We are ready to rock and roll, and here is Jennifer this morning. Morning, Jennifer. Our IT team has cracked the problem.
Good morning, everyone. Nothing like having Outlook crash at 8:56.
You know, in the wake of pulling off the annual meeting, I think all things like that are kind of, it's old hat. It's fine. It gets fixed, and the world continues to spin on its axis.
That's when I yell at, no, I don't want to sign into WebEx now.
No. Oh, God, sign into WebEx. Yes. Force quit. There should just be a force quit button on the side. It's going to be that kind of day. We're already kicking off. Arthur Klausner has very helpfully asked who wins the baseball game tonight, because that's a biotech focused question. Thank you so much, Arthur.
Yeah, I'll let you and Bob opine on that one. I'm not touching it.
I don't know. It's
so good morning.
Anyway,
yes,
let's talk about biotech.
Everybody.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Apologies for my last minute and somewhat dramatic entrance this morning. We are thrilled you're here with us and to join our guest, Bob Silverman, again for our virtual breakfast series. We have been really thankful to have such great partners like Woodruff Sawyer that have worked with us throughout the year, and amazing guests like Bob that you're going to hear from next to talk about all things biotech. And today we're going to be primarily focusing on his journey. He didn't start out as a BD guy. He like the rest, some of others of us have lawyerly backgrounds, and we've chosen to do different things with our training. So we're looking forward to digging in, Bob, to your story. And as always, please ask your questions as we go through the conversation in either the Q&A box or the chat feature. And Derek and I will monitor those as we have our conversation with Bob. So thank you, Bob, for joining us. And I'll turn it over to Derek to kick us off.
All right, Bob, thank you so much for being here. It's every time we do one of these, I get excited about all of our guests, but there's a little piece of me that gets a little bit more excited when there's somebody who has kind of been a big part of New York City's emergence and escalation as a biotech cluster. So I'm really excited for you to be here. You've got a great background, and there's tons of stuff that we can talk about. So what we usually do is have our guests kind of kick off the program with a little bit of an origin story. So for our viewers, why don't you tell everybody kind of how you got to be where you are today?
Great, will do. Thank you. And thanks, Jennifer and Derek, for inviting me. I've listened with jealousy as you've interviewed others, and have commented many times, Derek, that I think you're going to be, you have a second career as a talk show host someday.
If anyone else from The View tests positive with COVID, I'm ready to step in.
Sure. So yeah, I'm happy to start at the beginning and just kind of go chronologically.
Yeah, go for it.
And there might be people who are at the kind of very early part of their career who are, trying to figure things out for themselves, and maybe the story of my journey might, hopefully make a little sense in that context, or and help people think things through. So I have to say that looking at the time, as I've been going through my career, at the time in which things happen, a lot of events seem kind of random. But looking back, I think the people that I've connected with, the people in general that you connect with, it's really not random. It has to do with kind of how your own ability to self-direct yourself to fly with people who've got kind of some commonality. So that's something which I only recognize looking backwards, actually. So anyway, I was actually a chemistry major in college. I went to a small liberal arts school in Pennsylvania. I grew up in New Jersey, went to a small liberal arts school in Pennsylvania. I was a chemistry major in college with this kind of broad stroke idea that maybe I'll try to do something in medicine or whatever, who knows. So, but it turns out, although I enjoyed the study of chemistry, I actually wasn't very good at it. So this is one of those random events, right? So there was I distinctly have a distinct recollection, and it's remained with me all these years later, that there was a day that the college offered for chemistry majors, and it was alternative careers for chemistry majors. And this was my junior year of college, and one of the people who it was a patent attorney. And what he presented and what he projected about the field of patent law, it resonated with me. Because what I loved about this study of chemistry was like I got to learn about all these kind of different ways in which chemistry interfaces with the world around us. And I love learning a little bit about a lot of these different ways in which the world works from a scientific perspective. And so I just made a decision at that point in time that rather than going for further laboratory work or going for, some people were going into sales, actually pharmaceutical sales, actually with a chemistry degree those days, I decided I wanted to try my hat at becoming a patent attorney. So I went to law school, although I went with a very open mind as to what I would end up doing after law school. But I went with the clear idea that at the end, unless something struck my fancy significantly more, I would become a patent attorney. And so I went to law school up in Boston and graduated from law school, and then got my first job was at a New York City law firm. In those days, it was a high-flying patent intellectual property firm, Penny and Edmonds, for those who maybe are a little bit, older. I remember Penny and Edmonds. But they were very influential back in, this is in the 80s and early 90s, very influential in actually helping to build the whole biotech ecosystem from the perspective of patent law. It was Penny and Edmonds who really was one of the firms that was at the cutting edge of creating patent law associated with biotechnology. And in those days, the law was not so clear as to what patents and recombinant technology actually meant. Things like even like, are antibodies patentable? These were like real questions, right?
Yeah.
So I worked at Penny and Edmonds. I was very fortunate. I worked at Penny and Edmonds for about 3 years, and then at that point I had a family, and I wanted to kind of readjust my work-life balance or adjust my work-life balance. And one of the clients of Penny and Edmonds was Roche, and so I went in-house at Roche after about 3 years in private practice at Penny and Edmonds, really very junior level associate, within the firm, touching all different aspects of patent prosecution, patent litigation, doing a little bit of opinion work. I decided I really wanted to learn and go into a business. Pharmaceuticals was a good fit. Roche was a client of Penny and Edmonds, so I had kind of an easy way to get an interview, a first interview at Roche. But then I also loved what was going on at Roche, at the patent department at Roche, because they were really deeply involved in the licensing. It was clear during my interview process they were deeply involved in the licensing business, the business development part of Roche, and that was. And so at that point, I had in my mind that I really wanted to try to move my trajectory over to the business of pharmaceuticals, and Roche seemed like a really good kind of vehicle for that, the Roche patent department. So that's an example of like all these kind of connections that they're not random, but I only recognize them back. And Roche was a wonderful, the patent department was wonderful. And one of the reasons why it was so great was Roche was, really working on kind of the bleeding edge or the cutting edge of biotechnology. They were way ahead of the rest of the industry in terms of their interest in biologics as a foundational therapeutic modality. This is the early 1990s, right? But
this is well pre-Genentech, right?
Well, so Roche owned, at this point, by this time, Roche owned Genentech, but a majority, but it was very independent. It was, but Roche had just brought in polymerase chain reaction into the company for the diagnostics perspective, and it was still running in those days. It was still running the Roche Institute of Molecular Biology, which was and this was in Nutley, New Jersey, and that was a major quasi-academic facility for postdoctoral students would come and really study whatever they wanted to in the world of immunology and molecular biology. So anyway, so Roche had it had the way in which the patent department taught the young attorneys, I thought it was really unique, and it stuck with me throughout. So I was really grateful for the mentors that I had at Roche in those days. And one of the people, who was more senior in the organization, would actually take his time out, when we were working on license agreements, to literally walk me and as well as a couple of other colleagues who I had joined with at the same time, walk us through like every word of the agreement, understand why is this word here? Like what is the relationship of why we're constructing certain definitions in a document, in a legal contract? What is the relationship of these definitions to what the company's actually going to sell, right?
Which is amazing, right? To have,
it was
he could have just said, this is the boilerplate, this is what we do, this is our goal, right? We just execute this.
Yeah, it was really an incredible experience. And I think something that's oftentimes missing from today's world, where nobody has time to train, right? Train other people. And I especially see it in the biotech community, where you're expected to walk in and really, know your job straight away. There's no training going on, right?
Right.
So I felt very fortunate. And again, looking back, feel very fortunate that was the choice I made, was to go into that specific department and take the benefit of that specific practice. And so over time, I began to orient more and more towards licensing as kind of what I was doing as an attorney. Had my big break within Roche as a licensing attorney came in the late 90s. We were, there was a Christmas, over Christmas time, we had to put a deal together. And it was because Pfizer had bought, I think, Warner Lambert, and they had a product, and we wanted that product, but you had a very short period of time to put it together. And over Christmas time, the person who would normally have done the job, couldn't do it because of Christmas holidays. And so I volunteered, I'll do this. And so that ended up being kind of a major event actually in my career, just volunteering to work on a project. It ended up being a major event in my career because it turned out I did a job that got recognized and rewarded as being value added as an attorney, really running solo on a very substantial project for the company. It was actually a three-way negotiation because at this point, Roche and Genentech were separate, fundamentally separate. So Genentech was getting US rights, Roche was getting ex-US rights, and then there was a licensor, which was actually OSI Pharmaceutical, which was a Long Island company. And so that actually was a key ingredient to propelling my trajectory within the company. 2001 came along at Roche. Roche had gone through some difficult times in 1999, 2000, kind of in that era, and it completely reframed how it was going to operate business development. And I, again, felt very fortunate to be selected as one of the original global licensing attorneys for the company. We had 3 global licensing attorneys that were selected to kind of craft that function within the company. And I was fortunate to be one of those 3 that was one of the original ones. This is 2001. So if you go back in time, at this point in time, most pharmaceutical companies did not have these kind of umbrella business development departments. Roche was ahead of its time. In that regard. And I, to Roche's credit, it was looking at its Genentech experience and recognizing that a certain way in which it wanted to frame collaborations with the biotech community, which was very much informed by its experience with Genentech and essentially leaving Genentech alone in a lot of ways, right? And then secondly, recognizing way ahead of the rest of the industry that there's a step change about to come in terms of where innovation is going to becoming more and more derived from, and Roche recognized super early that innovation was going to be derived and come out of entrepreneurial biotechnology science, scientific community, much more so than was previous. So we walked into creating this company. We would license, a product a year, maybe from the external world outside of Roche. Most of business development was really around research, sponsored research agreements, scientific collaborations, and a lot in the promotional side, working with other pharma companies on co-promotion deals in those days was a big deal. A big thing, we said, and rather than doing one deal a year to bring in 1 asset a year, the objective was to bring in 10 assets from the external community a year. So it was just
wow,
right? And Roche was way ahead of the rest of the industry in this. Maybe Lilly, I think Lilly also had kind of a similar philosophy, but other than that, everybody else was very much internally focused still in those days. And so so I became one of the original global licensing attorneys. My boss at that period of time was a fellow named Brad Bolzen. Brad has since gone on to be the head of Versant Ventures, which of course has a very large presence in New York City. And that was, again, like one of the people I ran into who had a very significant effect in terms of how I thought about the rest of my career. And you could look at it as a random, but it wasn't that random actually looking back in terms of why do we connect with each other, right? couple years in, as a globalistic attorney, Brad asked me, "Do you want to just negotiate the deals?" And so I did that, and I formally joined business development, and was no longer an attorney. Now I'm became a business developer. And as a business developer, I was in a position called negotiator. I loved that position. It was fun. There was 3 of us who were negotiating all Roche pharmaceutical deals. So Roche was putting together 70 deals a year, 75 deals a year. I was working on a third of those, right? So my deal sheet in that period of my career was huge. And it was all different sizes, shapes, phases. And so I had this really unusual position in the company, along with a couple other people, this really unusual position in the company where I actually got to see across the entire value chain. So again, I got to learn a little bit about how everything pieced together. I wasn't deep in any one specific thing. I needed to rely on all the resources in the company, but I understood how the industry wove together from discovery through commercialization, right? And not that many people, even in very large organizations, very few people actually have the opportunity to have that exposure to the full thing. And so all that while, Brad was kind of chirping to me a little bit in the background as he had left Roche, and it's like, you really should learn about venture capital, because that's who's actually driving the business of the innovation that you're bringing into the company. And so a few years into my job as a negotiator, I had the opportunity to work part-time as a Roche secondee at Pappas Ventures, with Pappas Ventures, you mentioned before, Derek. Again, it was kind of just one of these transformational opportunities, and something I just volunteered to do. When we set up the relationship with Pappas Ventures, most people, it was offered to anybody in the business development team could have gone and done that job. And it was presented as kind of like an analyst position, but me and another fellow who's now a CEO of Milestone Pharmaceuticals, a fellow named Joe Oliveto, we actually kind of crafted it as more like an entrepreneur, almost like an entrepreneur in residence position. And so we went down. I did it actually. Joe did it first at a full-time basis. Then I went down and did it as a part-time basis. When I was there, we spun a company out of Roche that ultimately got acquired by Merck and is now a key part of the Merck pipeline. But more importantly, from a personal perspective, I got to learn about how venture capital works, and I began to make a lot of connections in the venture capital industry. And then I volunteered to take on an initiative in Roche, which was called Extending the Innovation Network. And the question was, how do we actually drop ourselves more robustly into emerging innovation geographies? In those days, we thought China was going to be an emerging innovation geography, as well as Israel. This is 2008, 2009. So, pretty forward thinking. And the second was academia. What can we do better in academia, or how can we more systematically lever academia? And the third was venture capital. What should we do with venture capital, which is had grown to be a very important, influential player in the biotechnology ecosystem. And we wanted to think that through. So I took that role on, and then again, I volunteered for something completely different, because then we were creating, about 2 years into that, we were then creating a new department in the pharmaceutical business development team, which was it was essentially an M&A function within the pharmaceutical business development team, 2010 or so, recognizing, oh my God, you know what? We're going to have to start buying these companies. Licensing isn't always going to be an answer. And so we created this M&A center of expertise within the business development team. And I was fortunate to be a founding member of that. Again, just volunteering for stuff, right? So, hey, we have this thing to do. You want to do it? And let's try it. So I did it for a couple of years, always with and that was very late stage focus, but always with the idea that I wanted to expand my skill set, especially with respect to understanding analytics and, how do you be an analyst, have an analytical framework to what I'm doing. But always with the idea that I wanted to go back into early stage and really support kind of the early stage part of what Roche was doing, and that ended up to be the case, because then again, around 3 years later, we crafted a new organization within the business development team, which we called Venture Innovation. It needed somebody to lead the venture part of it, and so I raised my hand. I was like, I can do that. And so it was about outreaching. How will Roche, as a pharmaceutical division, outreach to the venture capital community and really craft a systematic approach towards building our pipeline through engagement with the venture capital community. And so, the answer was, we're going to create a bunch of companies. In these days, this is still in the 2008, 2009, this is 2008, 2009. It was difficult for early stage venture capital firms. So what we ultimately ended up doing was a lot of build to buy companies with the venture capital community.
Yeah. That scenario is kind of the complete and total opposite of the venture scenario now.
It's amazing how things have changed.
They just had a crash. Like there was no Series A capital available. Companies, if they did a $10 million Series A, they were lucky and fortunate, and lived to fight another day. Whereas it's slightly different now.
Oh my God. Yeah, no, And so for people who weren't around in those days or weren't part of the, look at today as like, this is like the gravy train if you're starting up a company. It's never been better, right, to start a company than it is right now. But it was really hard back in those days to start a company. And I think there was 0 biotech IPOs from like 2009 till 2012 or something like that.
Yeah, there was a few. It was the question of when is the window going to open up again? When is a biotech IPO even going to be feasible? I mean, really, if you explain this to a young banker today, they'll think you're kidding. They're gonna think you're lying to them.
So for those of us who are engaged in the biotech community today, please, I think we should all look at this as one of the great times in biotech to actually.
It really is.
Go ahead. Keep going. Oh, so I was going to say, so then the company had a organizational event which was way out of my control, which was that we closed down the New Jersey facility, and what we did was we opened up a very small facility from what was in New Jersey, and we were looking to figure out what to do with a small group of people at Roche. And it turned out we moved into New York City, right? After a lot of reviews of where we're going to go. There was, everything from Boston to North Carolina was actually in the range of where we were going to move this team. It turned out we moved it into New York City, and we moved in 2014. So I was in the venture and innovation team within the business development group. I thought being in New York would be a really good solution for me because I thought New York was relatively untapped at that point in time in terms of my opportunity to engage with my primary function as the venture guy in the pharmaceutical. I thought I could actually position myself a little bit uniquely in New York City. And yet still, it's very easy, day trip up to Boston. I can be in a meeting in Boston at 8:30 in the morning coming from New York City, right? Or down to Washington, D.C. or whatever, or Philadelphia, it's very central, right? And I thought that was kind of interesting and cool. And so anyway, so we ended up as a organization moving ourselves into New York City. We worked with Alexandria. So we became an anchor tenant at the Alexandria facility over on the east side. We were the anchor tenant of building 2. And so we moved in 2014. Now, when I had been in New Jersey, I never really took advantage of New York City, when we at the New Jersey facility. I didn't know what I was missing until I went into New York City and really began working out of there as part of the site leadership team for the New York Roche facility, and recognizing all the vast opportunity that existed within the city. So that was kind of eye-opening for me as well. Anyway, so I moved in there. My job was still at this point venture and innovation, is leading that initiative. It was a pretty successful initiative. We had a small team that we were operating at in New York City as Roche, worked closely with Judy Dunn, who of course became a key player in New York in 2015, 2016, kind of that era. And then 2017, I actually saw an opportunity to work with the diagnostics division. So Roche has 2 divisions, a pharmaceutical division, a diagnostics division. And through my lens of the venture capital effort, I actually noticed that there was an element in the diagnostics division that was missing, which was that most diagnostics companies really didn't have the capability or the understanding of how do you actually develop a diagnostic product, and Roche had that, and so I thought we could develop that for therapeutic biotechnology, specifically biotech companies. So we did that, and then I reached a retirement age at Roche, so I retired. And then I moved into biotech from there, being very involved with early stage stuff. Moved over to Alloy Therapeutics under this leadership of Eric Anderson as their initial chief business officer, or their startup chief business officer, if you will. And then recently now, I'm with a new company, Rejuveron, which I hope to talk about a little bit today. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that I wanted to talk about, because we talk to a lot of people who are in early stage companies, and we see this with a lot of, people throughout the industry. So, but both BD and venture folks are really some of the most visible people in biopharma. They're the kind of relationships that startups covet because, deals are incredibly valuable. So, can you talk a little bit about almost, how you approach that role as a BD and licensing person, knowing full well that all of the startups that you meet kind of look at you as this representative of, this big company that they hope to secure a deal with. And, and after that, you can talk about now being on the other side of that equation.
So, yeah, sure. So I think, I'm just going to let my dog out of the room. 1 second.
Okay, we're a dog-friendly webinar. It's fine.
Yeah, sorry about that. He wanders in and out, and he walks in, and then he realizes I'm, doing really boring stuff as far as he's concerned, and then walks out. So, from the big pharma side, I think that it is true that the business development team, of course, is the external representative of the company. Yeah. The best way to get deals done with big pharma is not through business development. Actually, this is a kind of advice I'll try to offer. The best way to get deals done with pharma is actually because there's a connection of your scientific team with other scientists in the big pharma company. So in the big pharma company, a lot of what the business development team is doing is kind of, shielding the company from just the magnitude of opportunities that are out there, right? And trying to orient a certain focus to the lens into the external community in terms of deal making, right? So a lot of business development is actually shielding the internal organization from this, an incredible wave of outreach that comes into the organization. So it's actually hard to get the attention of a large pharma organization, unless you've got a scientific relationship, right? And so I really encourage biotech teams to think about how to best engage your scientists in the business development process, or your scientific advisors in the business development process, to make those connections over, and to really start by starting with really engaging the scientific teams at the big pharma companies. And that can happen like one way is through conferencing. Present your science, right? Present your science at external conferences, so yeah, as an example. So that was a learning from the big pharma side, in terms of advice that I can give to, more startup companies or smaller companies. It's really hard to get the attention, actually, like real legitimate attention at large pharma companies. And at the end of the day, the scientists drive the decision-making in large companies, oftentimes through structures associated with decision-making, like decision structures. So, you have to go through different committees along the way. But those decisions are, the business development team will kind of run the process, but the decisions typically is going to be scientists making decisions, and they're always. And I think it's just natural human nature to be more comfortable to connect and to engage with the science that right. So.
Well, and what you're working on and what your teams are working on, so how other science might either support or fold in, right, or benefit, the science that you're.
Yeah. Now I think the funny conversation, or kind of it was on the venture side, right? It was interesting, right, to hear how those conversations went. So how those conversations unfolded. So the venture community obviously sees the pharma community as one of the outlets for an exit, right? So, so the venture community really wants to understand, what is the pharma community like? What does the pharma community want to buy? What data do we need to put into the programs for the pharma companies to be interested in? So the venture community, it was always easy for me on the pharma side to get a meeting with the venture capital firm, because that's the conversation the venture capital firm wants to hear is, we're creating such and such a company, and what data should we, what's the experiment that you would want to see? Or sometimes it's, should we even create such and such a company? Would you guys be even interested, right? And the funny thing was, the pharma companies actually, we wanted to meet with the venture firms because our scientists were what these guys work on is so cool. I want to meet what they're working on. I want to learn what they're working on. And so oftentimes those meetings would be the pharma companies asking the venture firm, what are you guys working on? The venture firm was after the pharma companies, what do you want us to work on?
The circle.
Yeah, it could be a bit of a circular meeting, exactly. Yeah, so that was a interesting observation from working with the venture capital community. Is actually the pharma companies have this undue, I say an outsized influence, and their ability to really determine what is going to get worked on in venture settings.
Absolutely.
So if the pharma company can express, I'd like you to work on I think this is interesting science. It's not ready for us yet, but if you guys can build it, that's actually a great way for a pharma company to influence what's going on at the biotech community.
Right.
Yep. I think it's something that's kind of underappreciated, how interconnected the various levels of the scientific and entrepreneurial communities are here. And biopharma, larger companies may be, the outlet and the exit, but also, they're the companies with the organizations that actually get to the patients, that actually get the drugs to the people that actually take them, and have a really good understanding of what the on the ground stuff looks like. And like you said, it's a bit of a circle, but I'd rather think of it as a network where each level kind of touches all of the other levels. There is no biopharma layer, startup layer, and academic layer. It's actually pretty fluid, with all of them being pretty well connected.
I think that's definitely the case in today's world. And
yeah,
the reality is that there's an explosion of technologies, and there's no way that pharma companies can house all the technologies under a single roof. So the pharma companies have a very interesting and difficult challenge, which is what is core to pharma R&D that needs to be done inside versus what can be leveraged from the outside. I really respect and the people who make those portfolio decisions in the pharma companies, because it's ultimately what drives the entire value of the pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah.
The decisions that are made at the portfolio.
And you've got a number to hit every quarter, right? You've got the public markets that are judging you on quarter by quarter performance. So, it's good to be right over a 5-year span, but if you're wrong or off every quarter, you get punished for it.
It's very challenging. It's very challenging actually for pharma companies to really make those decisions as to what are we going to engage in today versus what are we going to wait for versus what are we just going to do in-house versus what do we think we want to kind of strategically / opportunistically try to reach. And so a large segment of conversations in the pharmaceutical industry is just that. It's like, what is the balance between what we're going to do internally versus externally?
Mm-hmm.
And it's very challenging conversations. And I've seen one of the shifts I've seen in the pharma industry over the last 20 years is actually pharma industries, the pharma side of it, I think, benefits from anything that has to do with scale, tends to kind of fall nicely in the pharma domain.
Yeah.
Data science. I've noticed that the pharma industry is becoming much more oriented towards data scientists as the core enterprise of the discovery organizations.
Yeah.
Right.
And oftentimes, like, leaving medicinal chemistry, used to be kind of, that's what you did as a pharma company.
Yeah.
That's, or protein engineering is now sometimes, we can hire people to do that. So it's very interesting to see how that these interfaces of the different disciplines kind of, they do change over time.
Yeah. I think it's great because when you get to that level, especially from the data side, you are very much working at scale, right? It's one thing to develop your data technology and your things on, probably your pilot set or smaller sets of patients. But really, when you get to, somebody with the data resources of a Roche or a larger company where, they have years and years of data to fall back on, that's when your algorithms can really get tested. So Jennifer, you were going to jump in.
Oh yeah, I was just going to ask, like, as you think, and I think as you've talked about having your scientists or your scientific advisory board, talking and connecting in, right, with the larger companies that could be a buyer right down the road or a partner at least. How do you advise earlier stage companies to approach things like JP Morgan, assuming we're going to be back right in San Francisco come January, and some of those, and bio right in the summer, the larger meetings? How do you, because those aren't scientific meetings, right? Those are business meetings. Talk to us about how you think that plays into the process.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, JP Morgan is a very important meeting because it is I think it's one of the very few, if not the only meeting where you actually have senior scientists from the large pharma companies all kind of aggregate or congregating in one spot. Mm-hmm. So along with senior scientists from the business development team and across all the different therapeutic area disciplines. Yeah. So it's very unusual from that perspective. So clearly you want to connect with the pharma companies. The pharma companies typically, will kind of rent a hotel in San Francisco. And then, they'll have, it's very complex meeting organization on the pharma side at JP Morgan. But yeah, you clearly want to take advantage of JP Morgan. But I think that I think that the best way to go in terms of creating your initial engagement with a pharma company, I think it's still scientifically and getting your scientist, having a scientist publish or present or somehow make the science, viewable to the pharma companies who are attending the same, whether it's a therapeutic area conference or a technology conference, like, PEGS in Boston is a good one on the protein engineering side. I still think having the first level of engagement be at the scientific side is a better way to get a deal done, because you'd rather have the scientist telling the BD team, hey, can you find a way to meet you guys, as opposed to the BD team saying, I think this might be interesting. I don't know. What do you think? Right. So I definitely encourage JP Morgan. I mean, Bio is more, in my experience, is more of a pure BD engagement. One thing I like about JP Morgan is the 50-minute meetings. I think they lend themselves to for whatever reason, more so than a half an hour meeting, lend themselves to having a better conversation. And I I've always enjoyed that JP Morgan is kind of self-organized. So I for whatever reason, I just find that the conversation, I think it might have to do more with the time. It's just get a better layer of depth. Also, pharma companies use JP Morgan to really trigger their year-long planning to what they're going to do, right? So again, I think that makes JP Morgan like kind of, you have to be there.
Necessary.
Somehow have to be engaged with it. It's a little bit harder now because it's semi-virtual, but you still have to somehow attach to the beginning of the year processes, right? So you want to get that foot in the door, and it's interesting. I think one of the things that's hard to get people to understand is the concept of the time it takes to get traction. So it's not like you meet with a scientist and they love everything that you're doing and immediately you move to a BD process. It often depends on which scientists you're looking at, and do they have to talk it over, and do they have to think about it, and how, and only then do you actually start to get a bit of a spark of interest. I think a lot of early stage companies say, well, we have this meeting with Roche, and they go and sit down for the meeting with Roche, but it's really kind of, how do you actually get your ideas into the organization, who's discussing them, and how do you get to the point where the collective organization is interested enough to move forward? There's almost an assumption of immediacy sometimes that really isn't the case. Yeah, that's correct. I mean, it can take years actually for a project to actually percolate through the pharma kind of circle. Look, at the end of the day, clinical data is what matters. And so companies will transact very, very early these days, but still, the value is in clinical data. The pharma companies, so, and the other thing to recognize is that because of the time that people people move jobs, right, in pharma companies. So that strategy that I talked about before, it does change. Over 6 month, 12-month periods, even it changes. So I think a useful exercise for biotech companies is map your pharma companies. Understand. And a lot of information is available now over the internet. Like pretty much every large pharma company puts their partnering brochures now out onto the web. That used to never be the case. So it is a little bit easier now to understand what are the scientific focal points of interest for pharma companies. It's easy to now understand, okay, who I have to talk to, because it's mostly available on the internet or through LinkedIn.
And they list the people. If you want to talk to our cardiovascular guy, here he is. Send him an email.
Exactly. So then that did not exist even 3 years ago.
You had to find them.
So my suggestion would be make maps, and then go meet, have some conversations. You probably never quite get a clarity as to where you are in the pharma company thought process. A lot of times you get early no's. Early no's are good. It's actually better just to get, hey, we're not interested until this clinical data. That's great. Yeah, because it helps you to kind of focus your attention elsewhere. So that's great. But stay tuned to those mapping exercises and create your maps as a suggestion.
I almost hate to switch gears now because this is really interesting, but I really want to get to the point of the story where you talk about, now you've stepped into Rejuveron, right? So how did you find how did you find Rejuveron? What was your process like of thinking about what you wanted to do? And what were some of the things about the company that made you say, yeah, this is the next thing I want to do?
Yeah, pretty similar to the way I found Alloy coming out of Roche into Alloy, which was, it was more about who do I want to work with. So the way I found Alloy was I had been friends with Eric Anderson for a while.
He's great.
Through Roche Business Development. He's the CEO of Alloy. He was previously the CEO, the Chief Operating Officer and founder of Adimab. And he's also founded a number of other biotech companies that are more kind of content driven, Adimab being more of a platform company. And Alloy was like the next thing that he was going to do, which was designed more like Adimab because it's a platform company. So Eric and I were kind of always, we'd always, when we ran into each other at conferences, we would always just catch up with each other. One of my previous bosses, Jason Coloma, is friends with Eric. He was on Eric's board. And so that's how I connected with Alloy, right? And so it was through a network. So the same thing happened with Rejuveron. I had, with Eric, had reached a conclusion that at Alloy, kind of what we had designed to build, we kind of built it and it's ready for the next kind of, the commercial side was being run by Heather Swable very capably. She doesn't need me anymore. And so we just decided, I don't think there's necessarily a full-time thing here for me. So I was ready to move on to my next thing. And over the summer, a former colleague of mine, Matthias Steger, who's the CEO of Rejuveron, reached out just completely coincidentally and said, hey, I'm looking for a head of business development. Do you know anybody? And I was like, well, we should talk with each other, right? And so,
maybe.
So, because we had been in touch with each other for years, and as Matthias was building his post-Roche efforts, and we always noodled around how could we work together? What would that look like? What could we do together? So he approached me. It turns out that there's a common investor between Rejuveron and Alloy. A fellow named Christian Engermeyer is a very prolific European-based entrepreneurial investor, and he's associated with both companies from an investment perspective. So that gave me great comfort, was knowing that there's an investor who I understand what they're doing, and then Matthias, I was interested to work with Matthias anyway, so we chatted, and then I dug into the company next. So the content matters, or you have to be passionate about what you're working on, obviously, and what's the company doing. And so Rejuveron is about what we call age better, live longer. So it's about healthy aging, if you will, and it's
right.
What we're doing is we're designing medicines, or we're discovering and developing medicines to address diseases of aging, and specifically diseases that are mediated by the hallmarks of aging. So when Matthias first presented me in there are 9 hallmarks of aging, which are cellular and molecular processes. So this is pretty new science, right? So this is really kind of there was a landmark paper maybe 8 years ago, in 2013 or so, and it lays out the 9 quote hallmarks of aging, and these are the processes of cellular maturity or that kind of break down over time as people age, and then become the cause of disease. And so when I first started chatting with Matthias, I was like, oh, aging, that's okay, but there's it's kind of like a controversial field. There's been a lot of companies that haven't necessarily done the right thing, I would say, for the field. But when Matthias kind of broke it down towards how he was thinking about it and describing the hallmarks of aging to me in more detail, I began to realize that actually, what we're doing is we're really working on what is fundamentally at the real kind of edge of science today. And so it's mainstream biotech invested edges of science, things like proteostasis. How do you maintain proteostasis? Well, that's a lot of work's going into the protein degradation world right now. How do you kind of degrade proteins or not degrade proteins, or genomic instability? Well, there's a lot of work going in right now into DNA damage repair, as an example.
Right.
So we're really, so as Matthias was describing to me actually what they're doing at a scientific level, I was realizing more and more that actually the science that they're working on It's right, and it's right at the where venture and entrepreneurism is right now, right? The second thing that I realized as he chatted me through the principle is something which I believe deeply in, which is that diagnostics actually is what drives our ability to develop drugs. In other words, our ability to measure disease and patient outcomes as a result of the diagnostics that are the enabling diagnostics. That's actually why we're able to succeed in large part as a pharmaceutical industry. And what we're trying to do in terms of address quote healthy aging is we're trying to actually redefine disease and how we intervene with disease so that we are able, through medical approaches, or therapeutic approaches, able to intervene at disease before the disease becomes debilitating. And to me, I was like, wow, you know what? That's exactly why I got into this industry, was because I actually, I got into this industry because I want my work, hopefully someday to play some small role in people feeling better and having just a happier, better life, right?
Yeah.
But I've always been thinking about it from the perspective of, we should go after the most diseases where people are debilitated, right? Because that's where you have the impact. If you can change somebody's life who's been debilitated, that's what a marvelous outcome. And I had that first experience at Roche when I was working with the transplant team. It was wonderful. It was like really energizing to go to work and work on those products. As Matthias was talking me through, I was like, I began to reframe my thinking. This is just over the summertime, which is, why are we waiting until people are debilitated? Like, let's capture disease before people get, before people are sick. They have the disease, right? You have disease. Let's capture it before people get sick. And so that was really kind of what got me enthused about working with Rejuveron, was this idea that, we're at a point in time where we actually can really think about how do we truly help people age better, live longer. It's really, for us, it's about aging better. It's about the health span. And by nature of increasing people's span, people will live longer, but it's really thinking about that health span. And if you look at the most progressed economic countries, the United States, Europe, whatever, people are living longer, but their health span is actually getting shorter relative to the length of the life.
Yeah. No, it's interesting you bring up, I love the fact that you hit on the need for kind of diagnostics and data in here, right? Because, if we think about kind of the march of biology, right? The stuff that we know about things that happen in disease, you need to actually understand what a target does in order to actually hit it and have some idea of what's going to happen in the patient after you do so. And, our industry in a lot of ways is built on kind of these little pieces of information that just keep getting stacked on top of the pile. And we get to a point where, something like this becomes feasible, because a decade ago, this company probably isn't feasible, right? There's no traction. There's no ability for the idea, people, those markers are crazy. No way. It's all A beta.
It would not have been feasible. And actually, neurodegenerative diseases, of course, is one of the areas that's really primed for this type of effort. And And so the way Rejuveron is structured is it's actually at the top is Rejuveron in a way, and that's where we house the scientific and business expertise and other kind of general administrative functions that then get applied down into each subsidiary company. So we actually form vertical subsidiaries around different themes that we want to approach, and recognizing that each subsidiary at the end of the day is going to be working on very different diseases, very different indications. So we put this disease specialty into the subsidiaries, and then they take advantage of what is situated at the Rejuveron level, which is deep scientific experience, decades and decades of drug discovery and drug development experience, legal experience, human resource experience, all stuff. Like we have beautiful laboratories that companies can drop into in Zurich, actually. So all that stuff exists for the subsidiaries to take advantage of, but neurodegeneration is a great example, right? So one of our companies is, which we call vascular therapeutics, Rejuveron Vascular Therapeutics. It's designed to actually enhance the blood-brain barrier. So over time, as we age, the blood-brain barrier, it becomes permeable, but that's not the way you can actually, that's not the way in which, no, that's the way in which actually toxins, for example, cross through, like tau, crosses through, is because the blood-brain barrier has a certain permeability, which it didn't have when patients were younger. And so we're actually developing Okay, so we're actually designing molecules to manage to the permeability, the integrity of the blood-brain barrier. So again, like 10 years ago or 5 years, even 5 years ago, I don't think that's an approach that you could have really designed for. But
yeah.
But today we think it's possible, and we actually think that there's a subpopulation of Alzheimer's patients that we can start with in terms of clinical trials. That's one of the issues that we have to think about always with every program is what we call stepping stone indications, or how do we actually prove clinically that our hypothesis has effect on patients with disease. And so because we have really today, there's a future where we talk about treating people, I guess, but the reality of today is we have to treat patients, right?
If you need to run a clinical trial, you need an endpoint, you need an outcome, you need to measure it, there's all of these things to be able to prove it safe and effective. So you mentioned that you have really nice labs in Europe. Do you have any labs in New York City?
So as of today, we're going to start off in New York with a business and corporate office in New York City. So we're actually going to be moving into the BioLabs facility in a few weeks from now. And that will be our official Rejuveron US presence. And then we will see from there. So we definitely have an ambition, right? So the question is going to be the critical mass. Do we have a critical mass of projects? But we have a clear ambition. So
okay. So outside of the lab question, that was more of a softball for the team and the headquarters question. So why don't you talk a little bit about really kind of getting into New York, setting things up. Because it's always great to have a firsthand account of really the experience, getting into biolabs, talking to the city, all of those things.
Yeah, sure. I have to say, at some level, we're following a playbook of a tie, which is also in New York, and there's also a Christian Angermeyer production, if you will.
Production.
I like that.
And so the first purpose for being in New York City, or at least for us on the Rejuveron side, it is business development. It's scouting. Because the company right now is very European focused, there's a certain limitation. There's a fact, right? You see what you see based upon where you are and who you know. So we'll be opening the first people we're going to hire into the New York office will be an innovation scout whose responsibility will be to scouting New York, not just New York, but it's really North America. Using New York as kind of the launch point there, and also in investor relations, we'll be bringing in a very senior investor relations person into New York City. To help from that perspective, because we definitely see the opportunity in New York in terms of connecting with the investor community. And so those will be the first couple of hires that we're going to bring in.
Okay. And for the crowd, we'll actually put the links to those positions on our Twitter feed and on LinkedIn at some point today. We love to see people hire people in New York.
And so and then we'll grow from there, and that growth will be mapped out in the future. That's where we're at today. And then the process itself has been pretty straightforward. So Derek actually helped connect with a few different, the question was, where do we want to go, right? So we didn't want to just be in an office space, just some random office space. We wanted to be in a biotech community within the city. So we knew we wanted to be in the city, and we knew we wanted to be in some place where there's other biotech companies, right? Even though we're not doing actual laboratory work as of today in New York City.
Music to my ears.
Right. And so reach out. One of my first calls actually was reach out to Derek and say, hey, who should we talk to? And so it turns out we went with BioLabs down on 180 Varick Street. And the process was really straightforward. Very, very simple. I'm aware of the BioLabs just as someone who's been involved with New York for quite a while now. And also, catalyze some of the Roche relationships we have with Johannes Freuhoff, who's kind of, the proprietor of BioLabs. So I was well aware of the BioLabs and all the great, what they do across the country, and very impressed with the whole operation. And so they and so it was a very simple process, and they were very welcoming that as of today we don't have lab facilities, but we want to have this presence in a biotech incubator. They were very welcoming. So it really made it a pretty simple decision. So.
And I think we found with other, because our offices were at Alexandria Launch Labs for several years, and now we're in the process of relocating to the Genome Center, except COVID, got in the way. But it's nice now that we have so many different options for areas where you can be around other biotech companies and the people that work there. Whether like obviously at New York Bio, we're not in the labs either, but it's great to have these communities.
And we see more people from Europe using this playbook too. I think there are more companies from Europe that are establishing operations here, and it's a great place to do it.
I think one of the reasons is because I think there's a benefit to having a U.S. operation if you're going to go public. And right now, most companies are orienting towards going public at some point in the future, as opposed to kind of selling everything to a pharma company. So the
absolutely.
Public. And so I think that's part of the reason. I loved when I worked at Alexandria. I loved being at the Alexandria facility. It was beautiful. And everything was first class about it. I have to say, in terms of just like ease of getting around the city, I like where Biolabs is it's like the subway stop is right there. I can come in from pretty easily. So just on a personal level, makes a lot of sense for me.
Yeah. Well, I think it's one of these things where people ask about the which area from in Manhattan is Kendall Square. I don't think it exists. I think the fact that we have things all over the city is actually a little bit advantageous. Some places are easier to get to than others, but some places it's easier to get there from New Jersey, some places it's easier to get to from Westchester. At the end of the day, we're going to be fortunate. We're going to have a lot of different places that are, really established by people that are great at running biotech facilities. And I think we're going to get a lot done. So people keep asking that question, and I don't really feel too bad that we don't have one area of Manhattan that's going to be biotech central.
Yeah, I don't think
we need it.
Yeah, I don't think you need to. I think that's, at this point, I think there's nice optionality for companies coming into the city, and you should definitely go check out all the different options and see what's right for, everybody's personal situation. And I think it's great.
Yeah, well, we've got a couple minutes left, and you've just laid out this fantastic story of, all of the things that you've kind of noticed in your career about the industry. I think it's really exciting that you've stepped into a place where, kind of the time is now, right? You're at this, like you said, you're at the precipice of where it's investable and where biopharma would be interested in it. So for the last couple of minutes, why don't you just talk about where you kind of see the field going in terms of, larger biopharmas and smaller companies, and where you think you can take things?
Yeah, so I think that we're at an interesting place and time in the industry, because, it used to be that a pharma company there was a specific map that a biotech company had to follow. And the first was, you got to partner with a pharma company. You have to have pharma company partnerships for your main products. And then you become kind of your primary value is driven through the royalties you're receiving, as well as the program you may develop in the future. And then finally become a fully integrated pharma company. That's kind of the map in which biotech companies follow for many, 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 many years. I think that world's changed. And I think the world has changed. One of the reasons is because, today we're primarily focused on treating diseases to very select patient populations. So we really are orienting as an industry towards truly personalized medicine. And I think that enables biotech companies to build themselves out much further, much more downstream independently, if not the whole, and probably the whole way in a lot of instances. So in rare diseases, ultra rare diseases, specialty diseases, where again you're going after very specific patient populations, I really think that the biotech companies can build themselves all the way to the end, which is commercializing products. I think they can do it by themselves for the most part, and so that's a big change actually in terms of how biotech companies think about constructing themselves and the timing and approach of that. So I actually think that the first stop is no longer, we need to have our first product partner with a pharma company. I think biotech companies can think about, even at their very first product, how are we going to do this ourselves? And how are we going to scale? So the question becomes more about what's the right way to scale, not what's the right way to exit, what's the right way to scale.
Right.
Yep. Well, we sit at a really, really interesting time for the industry. I've been excited about this for a long time. I love seeing great people like you step into building companies, because I think that's where the next wave of great things are going to come from. So we're at time. Thank you so much for joining us, Bob. You've been an awesome guest.
Bob.
Everybody else, have a great day.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you for tuning in to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.